The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council had stood for 11,000 years, its obsidian columns rising into a ceiling of captured starlight, and in all that time, one seat had never been filled. It sat at the end of the curved dais, plain and unadorned, while delegates from 400 species draped themselves in jeweled robes and argued over trade routes and border disputes. The empty seat was a joke among the younger species, a cautionary tale among the old ones, and a closely guarded secret among those who remembered why it had been left there in the first place. High Chancellor Kael'zer, a being of crystalline plating and 7 gleaming eyes, had presided over that chamber for 3 centuries. He liked order. He liked predictability. And nothing about the seat at the end of the dais was either of those things. It is symbolic, he would tell newer delegates when they asked. A reminder of a species that chose isolation over unity. They were offered a place at this table 400 years ago, and they refused it. We do not chase those who run. That was, of course, a polite fiction. The truth was that 400 years ago, a council survey ship had drifted into the outer edge of a yellow star system, recorded a species barely scraping its way into orbital flight, and filed a report that would later be sealed under 17 layers of classification. The report had described, in clinical detail, a species locked in perpetual conflict with itself, armed to the teeth, breeding at an alarming rate, and possessed of an unsettling tendency to solve unsolvable problems through sheer, bloody-minded persistence. The Council's exobiologists had taken one look at humanity's history, its wars, its weapons, its refusal to stay extinct no matter how many times nature tried, and made a unanimous recommendation. Leave the seat. Leave it empty. Watch from a distance. Never, under any circumstances, provoke them. For 4 centuries, that policy had worked perfectly. Humanity expanded outward in fits and starts, oblivious to the silent arrangement keeping the rest of the galaxy politely, deliberately out of their way. The empty seat became furniture. A footnote. A story Chancellor Kael'zer told to make himself sound wise. Then the Dravoki expansion happened, and everything the Council had carefully avoided came crashing through the front door. The Dravoki were not subtle. Theirs was a culture built on conquest, on the belief that any system not actively defended was a system available for the taking, and when their scout fleets pushed into a quiet, unremarkable yellow star system on the galactic frontier, they found exactly what their doctrine promised them: a single inhabited world, modest fleet presence, no Council protection treaty on file. By Dravoki law, that made Earth fair game. The first wave hit lunar orbit 11 days later. The second wave never arrived, because there was no third wave needed, and the survivors of the first wave limped back to Dravoki space with stories that no one believed until the sensor logs were independently verified by 3 separate species. The Council convened an emergency session 4 days after that. Chancellor Kael'zer sat at the head of the dais, his 7 eyes fixed on the holographic display hovering above the chamber floor, watching footage that made his crystalline plating audibly hum with tension. 41 Dravoki warships, reduced to drifting wreckage in under 6 hours. Not by superior numbers. Not by superior technology, not really. Dravoki hulls were thicker, their weapons more numerous. By something else. By ships that fought like they had nothing left to lose and everything to prove, that took hits that should have crippled them and kept coming, that turned what should have been a massacre into a humiliation broadcast across 40 systems. Identify the responsible party, Kael'zer had ordered, already dreading the answer his instincts were supplying. The answer came back within the hour, a small, unremarkable insignia on the lead warship's hull. A circle, divided by a single curved line. The same symbol that had been quietly logged, classified, and buried 400 years earlier in a survey report that had recommended, above all else, that this species never be approached. The Council had left the seat empty to avoid provoking a sleeping giant. The giant had never been asleep. It had simply never been invited to the table. 3 weeks later, Ambassador Darian Voss walked into the Grand Hall of the Galactic Council, and the entire chamber went quiet in a way it never had in 11,000 years of recorded history. He was unremarkable to look at, a tall man in a plain gray coat, no ceremonial robes, no honor guard trailing behind him, no entourage of advisors whispering in his ear. He carried a single data slate under one arm and walked with the unhurried pace of a man who had absolutely nowhere else he needed to be. 400 delegates from 400 species watched him cross the chamber floor, and not one of them said a word, because not one of them knew what to say to the representative of a species they had spent 4 centuries hoping would simply never notice they existed. Voss stopped in front of the empty seat. He looked at it for a long moment, plain, unadorned, exactly as it had been left 400 years ago, and then he looked up at Chancellor Kaelzer. "I believe this is mine," Voss said. Kaelzer's 7 eyes blinked in an asynchronous ripple, a tell his species couldn't suppress under stress. "Ambassador Voss. The Council, we did not expect. You didn't expect humanity to find out you'd been watching us for 400 years and decided we weren't worth talking to." Voss's voice was conversational, almost mild, which somehow made it worse. He pulled the seat back and sat down, setting his data slate on the table in front of him with a soft click that echoed through the silent chamber. "I read the survey report, Chancellor. The one your predecessor's predecessor filed. Unsuitable for diplomatic contact. Recommend permanent observation-only status. Species exhibits unacceptable risk profile." He smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. "You were right, for what it's worth. We are a risk. You just spent 400 years deciding that meant you should hide from us instead of getting to know us." A delegate from the Thessaran Compact, a tall, willowy being with luminous blue skin, rose halfway from her seat. "Ambassador, the Council's caution was a matter of protocol, not malice. We had no wish to provoke conflict with an unknown variable." "You had no wish to deal with us at all," Voss said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. "There's a difference between caution and cowardice, Ambassador Thessal, and I think you know which one this was. You found a species that scared you, and instead of opening a dialogue, you filed us away like an unexploded bomb and hoped nobody would ever have to defuse us." He let that sit for a moment. "Then the Dravoki found us instead. And now you're all sitting here wondering what would have happened if you'd just talked to us 400 years ago instead of leaving us to figure out the galaxy on our own." Chancellor Kaelzer's plating had gone a shade paler, a physiological response his species couldn't hide. The Dravoki incursion was unsanctioned. The Council bears no responsibility for their actions. "No," Voss agreed. "You don't. But you do bear responsibility for what happened because of your inaction. We had no treaty. No protection. No allies, because nobody had ever bothered to offer us the chance to be one. So when 41 warships showed up over our homeworld, we didn't have a Council fleet to call. We didn't have an alliance to invoke. We had exactly one option, and that was to fight, and we are very, very good at fighting, Chancellor. It's practically the only thing 400 years of being ignored taught us how to do well." The chamber was utterly silent now. Even the ambient hum of the translation system seemed to have dropped to a whisper. "We are not here for an apology," Voss continued, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, which made the words land harder than any accusation could have. "We're not here to gloat about 41 wrecked Dravoki hulls, satisfying as that was. We're here because that seat has been sitting empty for 400 years, and we'd like to know why a galaxy full of species who claim to value diplomacy decided the safest thing to do with humanity was pretend we didn't exist." Kaelzer was quiet for a long moment, his 7 eyes dimming slightly, the closest his species came to an expression of shame. "Because we were afraid," he admitted finally, the words clearly costing him something. "A species that fights as hard as you do, that endures as much as your history shows you have endured, we did not know how to approach you without risking exactly the kind of conflict we feared most. We thought distance was safety." "Distance isn't safety," Voss said. "It's just a slower kind of danger. You don't make a fire safer by ignoring it, Chancellor. You learn how to use it, or it burns you eventually." He gestured to the data slate in front of him, and a new display flickered to life above the chamber floor, not combat footage this time, but something else entirely. Diagrams. Trade proposals. Technology exchanges. A list of treaty terms drafted not in the language of conquest, but of partnership. We're not here to take your seat by force, Chancellor. We're here to fill the one you already saved for us. The question is whether the rest of this council is finally ready to find out what humanity looks like when it's not fighting for survival, but fighting for something instead. Silence stretched through the grand hall, 400 delegates from 400 species absorbing the weight of 4 centuries finally come due. Then, slowly, deliberately, Chancellor Kaelzer inclined his crystalline head toward the man in the plain gray coat sitting in the seat that had waited 400 years for him. "Welcome to the Galactic Council, Ambassador Voss," he said. "We are long overdue in saying that." Voss allowed himself, at last, a small and genuine smile. "Damn right you are, Chancellor. Now, let's talk about the Dravoki, and what happens to anyone else who thinks an empty seat means nobody's watching the door." The galaxy, it turned out, had spent 400 years guarding against the wrong kind of threat. They had feared what humanity might do if provoked. What they never considered, what none of them had the imagination to consider, was what humanity might become once it was finally, properly, invited in. That mistake, more than any other in 11,000 years of council history, would prove to be the one they could never quite take back.